You have probably heard many different definitions of philosophy. You may have witnessed or even participated in discussions about whether philosophy is a science or not. Given the battles that unfold when trying to define philosophy, we can assume that it has many hypostases or sides, and that is why it is everything that is said about it, within the limits of what is acceptable. We will probably talk about the definition of philosophy and in particular about philosophy as a science another time. Today, I would like to talk about philosophy as a way of life, and in particular about the book by the French philosopher Pierre Hadot, which is called The Present Alone is Our Happiness. However, the translation of the title of the book can be a bit misleading. Originally in French, it is called La philosophie comme manière de vivre, which is literally translated as philosophy as a way of life. Such a strange translation was made to avoid confusion with another book that was published earlier and in English is known as Philosophy as a Way of Life, Spiritual Exercises from Socrates to Foucault. In French, the name of that book is Exercices spirituels et philosophie antique, which can be translated as Spiritual Exercises and Ancient Philosophy. To avoid misunderstanding, I'll add here a table where the original names and their translations can be seen. So today, we'll discuss the book by Pierre Hadot, known in English as The Present Alone is Our Happiness. Perhaps you have read from Hadot or someone else that philosophy at its very beginning of its existence was primarily a way of life. But everyone has some kind of a way of life, you might say, so absolutely all people are philosophers. Not quite so. Philosophy was not a way of life as such, but a special way of life, philosophical. This is a tautology, but its solution requires solving the riddle of what philosophy is, or at least what the philosophical way of life is. If we describe it in a few words, we can say that the philosophical way of life is a meaningful or conscious way of life, where life or existence itself is contemplated or realized. However, there are many philosophers who will briefly describe it differently. It's good that we don't need to describe it in a few words, because it would not convey the full breadth of the concept of philosophy as a way of life. I hope that reading Pierre Hadot's book will help you to understand this concept. I will make a small review of the book while trying to reveal philosophy as a way of life. For those who don't know anything about Hadot, I will say that he was a world-famous French philosopher, a specialist in ancient and medieval philosophy, and in particular in Neoplatonism, both ancient and medieval. During his lifetime, he wrote 12 of books and translated philosophical texts from ancient Greek and Latin into French. The main years of his work were at the end of the 20th century, so he is almost our contemporary. The book itself is a conversation or rather an interview with Pierre Hadot. His interlocutors or interviewers were his colleagues, the philosophers Jean Carlier and Arnold Ira Davidson. However, this is not a conversational interview, but a written one. This means that Hadot had time to think over each answer and weigh up each word. So it really reads like a book, not a transcript of a conversation. The questions posed to Pierre Hadot are completely different, including direct questions about certain events in his life and conversations about the history of philosophy and philosophy as such. The conversation begins with questions about Pierre Hadot's life, childhood, religious education and fascination with philosophy. For Pierre Hadot, two experiences that happened to him in his teenage years were fateful. They happened, one might say, spontaneously. In those two moments, he suddenly felt an anxiety that filled him with both terror and pleasure, and gave him a sense of presence of the world, and his own being in the world. Although it is difficult to describe this experience, Hadot says that for him, it was like an answer to the questions, who am I? Why am I here? What is the world I am in? From that moment on, he began to perceive the world in a new way, and enjoyed the world. Hadot says that this experience also influenced his concept of philosophy. Since then, philosophy has become for him a transformation of perception of the world. However, Hadot notes that this was not a mystical experience, neither in the Christian sense, for example as described by St. John of the Cross, nor as described by Plotinus. Somewhere in the book, Hadot admits that he has not experienced even the slightest mystical experience, even though he has spent decades studying the Neoplatonists. However, Hadot's experience can be considered irrational because it is inexpressible and provides answers to unanswerable questions. We learn from the book that the first philosophical system Hadot came across was Thomism. This is easily explained by his education in a Catholic seminary. However, Hadot does not perceive philosophy as a system, but calls it a life experience that changes the way you look at the world. In the book, Hadot often mentions another French philosopher, Henri Bergson, and his phrase, "Philosophy is not the construction of a system, but a decision once made to look at oneself and the world around one in a naive way." And Pierre Hadot's bachelor's thesis was devoted to the analysis of this very phrase by Bergson. As for the phrase itself, Hadot believes that it also resonates with the attitudes of many philosophical schools of antiquity. I'll talk about attitudes a little later. It resonates because a naive way of looking at oneself and the world means looking as for the first time or the last time. And if you look at the world and yourself in this way, then every moment of life is lived in its fullness. In addition, this phrase also speaks of constant surprise, because when we see something for the first time, it can cause sincere surprise and delight. Some people believe that philosophy begins with surprise, and I personally agree. Try to remember the first time you saw, say, mountains, a sunset on the sea or ocean, or looked up at the bright starry sky for the first time. And now imagine what life would be like if you looked at everything like that, as if for the first time and with wonder. But this can be achieved. Pierre Hadot was lucky. He achieved this through sudden experience. In his case, it took effort for him to maintain this feeling. But not every one of us has such an experience, though a philosophical way of life can be achieved without it. And here we come closer to the question, what is philosophy as a way of life? The first philosophical exercise Pierre Hadot encountered in his life was the so-called preparation for death. Hadot encountered this exercise and the definition of philosophy as preparation for death in Montaigne. Montaigne, in turn, interpreted Plato's texts in this way. This interpretation of philosophy made the young Hadot realize that philosophy is not just a theory, but a way of life. The very act of practicing death can be interpreted as an exercise for a better life, and this is how Hadot interprets it. He says that Plato is not talking about the exercise of dying, but rather about exercising in dividing the body and the soul, practicing in spiritual life, in the life of thought, about finding a way of knowing other than the sensual way. Not only Plato, but also other ancient philosophers have preparation for death exercise. Let's just mention the instructions Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, which are now published in the form of a book called Meditations. There he often reminds himself that he needs to think about the fact that death is inevitable. This is necessary in order to live life more fully and take life itself more seriously. In other words, the very reflection or meditation on the topic of death is an exercise in becoming aware of life here and now. Moving on to the exercises of Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics in general, we can also recall attempts to look at everything from above. Just for a second, try to look at your own life, at your troubles from above, no matter how far away, from some hill, from the window of a space station, or from another galaxy. It can help change your attitude to your own problems and to life in general. In his book, Hadot gives dozens of examples of such different exercises by different philosophers. He calls these exercises spiritual exercises. It is with these spiritual exercises that Hadot explains many contradictions and ambiguities in the texts of ancient authors. If we look at those ancient texts as those that were meant to produce an educational effect and make the mind of their readers work, bringing them into a certain state, then everything falls into place. I also want to share Pierre Hadot's reflections on what he calls transhistorical and intercultural philosophical or spiritual attitudes. This is what motivates us to do certain spiritual exercises, and because these attitudes are transhistorical and intercultural, they are open to you and me. And they, according to Hadot, are what makes ancient philosophy and any philosophy of the past relevant today. He cites the following as examples of the attitudes in ancient schools. In Epicureanism, there is the attitude to be relaxed and the attitude to accept the present. Stoicism has a similar attitude, the attitude of concentration on the present. Another example of a Stoic attitude is acceptance of fate. Pyrrhon and skeptics have an attitude of indifference, which encourages one not to make value judgments about things. A similar attitude can be found in some Eastern schools of philosophy, just as some Stoic attitudes have analogues in Buddhism. Neoplatonism has an attitude to overcome duality. Some Indian schools also have similar ones. As you can see, all of these attitudes, and this is not a complete list, are universal. That is why I think today on the shelves of bookstores you can find many books that teach you how to be a Stoic in the 21st century, using Stoic and Epicurean attitudes, like William Irwin's A Guide to the Good Life, or books like A Handbook for New Stoics, The Daily Stoic. Such books help the reader to identify these attitudes and update the practices, adjusting them to the present. Some attitudes are clearer to us, which is why there are so many books on Stoicism. Some are more complicated and obscure, such as ones of Plotinus. But Plotinus' attitudes were probably less clear than the Stoics' ones for his contemporaries. However, they are all timeless, that is, eternal. It follows from the above that all ancient philosophy, and sometimes not only ancient philosophy, is a way of life. Without active exercise, without the transformation of life, it ceases to be itself. And the authors wrote their texts not to provide information to the general public, but to form a specific audience. In the case of Plato and Aristotle, for their students. In the case of Marcus Aurelius, for themselves. Philosophy should not inform, but form. That is the idea that runs through all of Pierre Hadot's books. In particular, as I have already noted, that is what ancient philosophy and many later authors did. I would include Pierre Hadot among these authors, whose books rather form than inform. Let's take, for example, his book with such a theoretical title as What is Ancient Philosophy? It is not a dry account of history. It is a book that really forms the reader and calls for practice, for change, while explaining what ancient philosophy is. As for the book we are discussing today, The Present Alone is Our Happiness, it is also aimed at formation. Using the examples of many philosophers of the past and Hadot himself, the book shows what philosophy is as a way of life. And we see that philosophical life is available in any era. In one place of the book, Pierre Hadot writes that philosophical life is simply a conscious, consistent and rational life. This book shows how to live such a life, because living a conscious and consistent life requires effort. The book also shows what we can learn from the history of philosophy to live such a life. In the preface, written by Hadot's interlocutor Jenny Carlier, it is stated that the book is accessible to everyone. I agree with this. I really think that the book can be useful for people who are not familiar with the history of philosophy. But it seems to me that it will be better understood by those who are at least generally familiar with the history of philosophy. Finally, I should note that here I have outlined only a tiny part of what this book contains. Literally. For example, I have not mentioned the philosophical discourse, to which not even 1 but 2 chapters out of 10 are devoted. We have not talked about the search for wisdom. We have only slightly touched the topic of mystical experience. And I have not mentioned many other topics that this book raises. However, I hope that this video was useful to you, and that you found the book interesting. If so, please leave a comment. Please tell me if you have read the book, or are you planning to read it. Also, please tell me what books would you like to see reviewed here. Please like and subscribe to the channel. It will motivate me to make new episodes. See you soon. Bye.